Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today we have a very exciting guest joining us, Dr. Samuel Buckner. If you're in the evidence-based fitness world, you've probably heard his name come up in various discussions surrounding hypertrophy research. In fact, he was on a roundtable not that long ago on the podcast surrounding training volume and the dose response to hypertrophy. Sam is a leading researcher in exercise science, and his work has really helped bridge the gap between what happens in the lab and what we see in the gym. We'll be diving into some hot topics in the fitness space like scientific communication and the challenges of interpreting research. We'll also touch on the social media landscape and why it's so important to separate consensus from actual evidence. We're going to tackle an issue I think a lot of you will be able to relate to, the difference between what we see on social media versus what the scientific literature actually says. Sam has talked a lot about the need to be cautious when interpreting research and how strong opinions online can sometimes turn into facts without proper scrutiny. We'll be asking him why this distinction is so critical for evidence-based training and how you can develop a more critical mindset when consuming fitness content. It's going to be a deep dive into the science of training, but Sam is amazing at breaking down complex ideas into actionable takeaways. So whether you're a coach, athlete, or just someone passionate about optimizing your training, there's going to be a ton of value in today's episode. As a reminder, guys, if you like research, you may actually be incredibly fond of research reviews. One of which we're affiliated with is the Mass Research Review, headed up by people like Eric Helms, Mike Zordos, Eric Trexler, all people who have been on the podcast and are amazing at separating what we need as trainees versus just kind of jargon, and help us understand it in a really, really positive way. So if you're interested in subscribing to such a research review where they break down the latest and best in hypertrophy science, definitely check the link in the description because it's always linked there, and you'll be supporting us at the same time. And guys, without further ado, let's get into the chat with Sam. So Sam, you were on the podcast for episode 405. It was a volume roundtable and we were kind of questioning the dose-response relationship, but that was obviously a roundtable. Now we're here solo, one-on-one, and I really wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of tell the audience who you are a little bit more and explain that. So I know, like from my end, in terms of if I was introducing you, I'd be like the assistant professor in the exercise science program at the University of South Florida. You have a PhD researching and focusing on skeletal muscle adaptations to resistance exercise with a particular emphasis on muscle hypertrophy, which is great because that's kind of what this podcast is all about. Strength development too, but hey, we're sidelined that for the most part. Not too interested in that as bodybuilders. But I also wanted to mention you have over 170 peer-reviewed papers. So you have a true big track record in research and you know your stuff. So, but what else would you like to let the listeners know about you, Sam?
Yeah, that's a pretty good description. I think maybe just highlight that my recent interests, as a scientist, you change over time. Just like you mentioned, we don't care about strength so much. I used to really care about strength. And in fact, I think my most cited paper is determining strength. But my lab, more so these days, we just really care about muscle growth. And a lot of the work that I do is dedicated to better understanding what muscle growth looks like. And I'm pretty passionate about helping people contextualize what a change in muscle size should look like. And we talked about that a little bit on the last podcast. But I think we still have so far to go to really increase people's ability to read, interpret research effectively. So much of what you get online is confusing, polarized, or biased in one direction or another. And it doesn't mean necessarily that it's wrong, but sometimes it only provides you with a certain view. And, I think the ability to critically evaluate, what muscle growth looks like provides a different lens. And if I can just give an example, the one that I've been using a lot in class, and I used it in a seminar I gave at University of Central Florida recently, is the Goto paper that's been cited quite a bit in the discussion on length and partials versus full range of motion. Now, independent of the fact that I don't think that the long range of motion group trained at long range of motion, it's quite interesting that the change in triceps CSA was 48.7% in the middle range of motion group compared to about 28% in the full range of motion group. And my first question isn't, why is this group better than this group? My first question when I read that paper is, how in the world did the triceps grow this much? And, I think that's a worthwhile question. I'm more curious about what went wrong or what did the researchers do that enabled them to see such a result as opposed to, middle range of motion was superior to full range of motion. And, that's not just true of the Goto paper. You look across research and you find interesting things. Another example that pops to mind was the Larson drop set paper, right? Where the headlines on this particular paper were highlighting like 40 or 50% more growth in one group compared to the other. But when you look at the absolute change in muscle size, I believe it was 0.05 centimeters. And what you'll find if you measure ultrasound and you measure muscle thickness of some of these muscles, the sensitivity of your mouse, you couldn't even move the cursor that amount because it's so small. So it gives you this idea that, okay, as a percentage, we can make this look pretty impressive. But how compelling is that to a researcher, that has this perhaps, and it's not that I'm better than anybody. I do this stuff all the time, so I have a different perspective, right? So, it's not an appeal to, I got comments like experience is an appeal to authority. No, it's a perspective gained through experience, which has value, just like I think everyone's different perspective has value. So I'm going on a lot. I got off myself and got right into the
Yeah.
studies, but hopefully that gives people an idea of kind of what I'm passionate about. I'm really passionate about getting the best I can be at measuring muscle in my lab and then helping other people understand the nuances of measuring muscle. Um, so people can appropriately kind of assign their confidence in a certain topic, or it's significant in this study, but how compelling is this difference, and how much should you care about this difference? Does that make sense?
Yeah, in a really basic way, it makes me think of, I don't know, talking about weight loss in, I don't know, you could talk about it in grams versus kilograms or what have you. Like, yeah, grams sounds way more, or pounds versus kilograms or versus stones. And it's like, well, yeah, when you break it down like that, it sounds like more, but like it isn't. So again, using the percentage to kind of, yeah, I guess in a way, make it sound more impressive and larger than it is. And it would be easy to take that away as someone who's not as scientifically literate, or just someone who even is, but they've just listened to the percentage change. But when you boil it down to what you just mentioned there, it's like, hey, it's really not that big of a change. And then maybe what led to that change, if that was like exorbitantly more challenging or whatever it might be, is it worth it? Like so I think that's an important perspective to bring. And through your experience, that's the only way that you can really have that perspective, because I haven't peer reviewed 170 papers or what have you. Like I can't do that. So it's important to have people communicating that sort of thing in my point of view.
Yeah. And to kind of elaborate on the example that you used, because me and Holly were actually talking about this last night. And I as a teacher, I'm always trying to come up with analogies to help, last time I was on here, I used baloney, right?
Yes.
But I was just giving different examples or trying different examples that I thought might resonate with the listener. And, if you run a weight loss intervention and group A loses 1 pound and group B loses 2 pounds. Now you've coached a lot of people, 1 to 2 pounds over, let's call it a 12 to 15 week period. It could be within the error of the scale that you're using. It's not a huge difference. Now, at a group level, at an individual level, it might mean so, but at a group level, it's 1 pound versus 2 pounds. Neither is that impressive, depending on the context. But if you wanted to make that seem impressive, you would say group B experienced double the weight loss, right? Or 100% more weight loss in group B compared to group A. When let's say they're both 200 pounds and one lost 1 pound, one lost 2 pounds. So relative to what they were, these things aren't impressive, but we can frame it as impressive if we're clever. And, up until the last few years, you didn't really see these things in science communication in like science communication online, at least I wasn't aware of it. Um, but recently it's become more common. And I think maybe it got called out a little bit and it's happening a little bit less. Um, but it still does happen. And I think the responsibility of the scientist is to always communicate things in the most honest way possible. Um, and I don't necessarily think things are done unintentionally, but perhaps they still come off the wrong way, or can lead people to think like, oh my goodness, I'm not using this technique and it looks like it's very, very effective. And then you talk to a different person and say, I'm not sure that difference that they're talking about is measurable in a reliable way that we could replicate. So yeah, it's you know it's a perspective that's maybe hard to wrap the mind around at first, but hopefully that weight loss example helps a little bit.
Yeah, it's a challenging one because I know even for the podcast, we don't use clickbaity titles, but sometimes we try and make them engaging. We try and make them inviting because you're kind of playing that social media game to some extent because you, again, same with science communication, you want people to read it. I guess the same could be said for titles of studies. I think I've seen that change over time. They've become a bit more, I don't know, not newspaper-esque, but a bit more catchy, a bit more like that. And I think a degree of that is great, but it's like you said, it fundamentally still has to be very honest and represent things in the right way. And it's, navigating that element is one that, like you said, you're kind of straddling and trying to understand what's best because, you don't want to be so straight, narrow down the line that then no one sees it. But at the same time, you don't want to cause problems with misunderstandings by being so clickbaity that you've gone past the point of actually being honest.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, and I was talking to Brett Contreras about this actually because he he was sharing some of his hip thrust stuff from back in the day, and I think sometimes a person's confidence um, can exceed the current evidence, and that doesn't mean that their confidence is misplaced, right? It means their confidence is premature, and it means so you could have a conviction that I just know that this is going to be better and maybe the data isn't there yet. And I think sometimes, and Brett was reflecting on his younger self and sharing some wisdom, which I appreciated. But I think sometimes, especially young scientists, can get really excited and be really compelled and convinced, and maybe that leads to a message that's going to cause a ripple amongst the scientific community. We're like, we need to pump the brakes a little bit. Um, and then it happens on the other end too. Sometimes people can get a little bit stuck in their ways, and when a new idea comes along, it's met with just, all of the criticism that you could imagine. So this happens on both ends of science for sure.
Yeah, I totally can see that. And so I appreciate it with people. I'm sure Lane, as another individual where he, I don't know, maybe was steadfast with things and opinions. And the good thing I think of Lane, and I just remember in the past, I think it was maybe like BCAAs was something he was commonly, that was part of his research and everything. So he was very passionate about it. And then new evidence came out that it's like, hey, if you meet your protein requirements, BCAAs are kind of like an expensive way to flavor your water. And he corrected his opinion. It's kind of the same with Brett here, I guess, where the research has been coming out about, hey, maybe hip thrusts aren't the be all and end all for glute growth. And some of these lengthened positions are really, really important to be loaded. And so he's updating his opinion. But I guess when they've built a bit of a brand around a specific thing, it can be really hard. And so it's great to see such, I think it's the hardest part to kind of update your opinion and be able to do that. And it's been great to see that Brett's done that, and also like look at his younger self and be like, maybe I was a bit overzealous with that. And I can think about it with myself, with some of my opinions on things. Yeah. And that's actually something you've spoken about, where strong opinions on social media can start to become accepted as facts. So in your view, how can people be critical of this sort of information and kind of consume it in a productive way and avoid that kind of group think mentality?
That's a great question. admittedly, it's hard to do. Um, and perhaps the best way someone can protect themselves from that is to make sure you follow people who disagree. Um, and I think that's incredibly important. Follow people you disagree with and listen to everybody. Um, and yeah, maybe there's people that just have foolish takes. Um, and maybe it takes a certain level of education to be able to see through that. So I get the barrier for people that are just trying to get good information. Um, and with the current kind of climate of science-based knowledge, you know, I think oftentimes there are, I'll give you an example. Um, Recently I saw a post and it said, it was talking about the biceps and it was talking about long muscle lengths being superior. And it was one of Lane Norton's posts. And I commented because, he was kind of going back and forth with people in the comment section and he was saying, well, it's scientific consensus at this point. And I commented back, I said, I don't believe this is scientific consensus. My lab recently published a paper providing a different perspective. I think likely, doesn't mean that I'm right, but I still have a perspective. I think likely um, that it's exercise and muscle specific. And I don't think it can be blanketed across everything in the way that maybe some people are doing in some instances. Um, I got blocked after that, and I think I was probably blocked for other reasons, more personal. But either way, it was a shame to me that I couldn't be part of the conversation, right? And I can't tell you how many instances, especially with that topic, where I am blocked from comment sections and I don't think I'm ever rude. Um, and I think this needs to stop because I want to hear what Cass has to say about long muscle lengths. That podcast was great. Like I learned a lot. The biomechanical perspective is wonderful. Um, and you need that if we're going to figure out some of these things. You need Milo's perspective that's, really convinced and compelled by the data because he's going to keep it moving in a certain direction, right? And then we need Cass who and Brett who, are really into biomechanics and they have a different perspective based on leverages and activation, right? And then you need people like me and D'Souza who are maybe more interested in the physiology and the nuances of science interpretation and dissemination. Um, and there's other folks that are contributing to the conversation as well. And I believe it's really important that all these different groups should want all the different groups to be heard, right? And I don't know that we've done a good job of that so far. I think people like you've had everybody on, you've had discussions with everybody. Um, but I do think the current climate seems to almost silence people that disagree, which has never been my experience of science. Science is never scared of a different opinion because it's just a different opinion, right? And you can lean on the evidence and the weight of the evidence, and you can share your take, and someone else's take doesn't undermine yours. It challenges it, perhaps. Um, and um, I think more and more with social media, we're going to have to be more cautious. And I again, I'm answering way too long for a simple question, but the answer is if everybody you follow gives the same message, I would follow more people, find people with a different perspective and listen. And it's very difficult to make an educated decision yourself, but my experience is the answer is usually somewhere in the middle, right? And it takes maybe a decade to actually land in that place where now there's actually agreement and there's not these polarized sides on a topic that are arguing and talking past each other. So that would be my advice, I suppose.
It was a challenging question because I thought about it ahead of time. I was like, I don't know how I'd necessarily answer that because it does demand maybe a degree of like scientific literacy and ability to just like remove certain people. And I do think if someone talks in extremes and lack of nuance and those sort of like a bit black and white, I think that's an easy way to just be like, draft those people out. But I really love your example of following people that maybe you even disagree with, because I can personally think of my younger self, I don't know, 5+ years ago, I was in that position of maybe frustrated with differing opinions. I was just like, I'm just going to follow this person or these people, and they're my gurus, because that just cleans out the noise. They are like, put them on a pedestal. They're right about everything. And I've since matured. And as an example, I use this regularly because I now have Kasim on the podcast regularly because I think he's a fantastic person in the industry. But he was someone who some people almost warned me about him and almost like inviting him onto the podcast, not sure about this guy. And so I was kind of a bit standoffish at first, and some of his information maybe sometimes I think in the past it maybe was a bit extreme with like X's and ticks and things like this with some exercises. And since he's matured as well, and he does a great job of disseminating and communicating, I think. And now I really like having him there, and I don't agree with everything he says, but now I don't agree with everything the previous guru said, because I'm listening to all these voices. And I'm glad you think at least this podcast is doing a good job of bringing on voices, because that's something I also didn't want to do, was kind of be part of a pack and be like, hey, I'm just part of them and I'll only have these people on the podcast. I'm selective by all means. I try and not have people who I think are putting out harmful information or just aren't useful. But yeah, I like to have voices on, and it's something you've spoken about in terms of the kind of online fitness space where disagreements and debates aren't always welcomed, where people only want like yes people in their corner. And I hadn't thought about the fact that someone could put out a post and they can control who can comment. They can control like if someone's blocked or not. Like, you don't know as a onlooker, your comments are just, they could be hidden from everyone who's viewing that. And now they're lacking that perspective and they just think, oh, everyone just agrees on this topic. It's done. So yeah, that lack of open discussion is not a good thing.
That's the reason I wrote a paper on long muscle lengths. I didn't want to write a paper, but I was very ineffective of, I eventually found out I don't show up in comment sections, and if I was ever disrespectful or mean, like I don't think so. But you could have the best intentions and say something in a way that's very professional, and someone can read it in their head, I think, in just a horrible way, and then think you're just a hater. And I think some people have viewed criticism from scientific peers as haters. I've heard the language used, and it's like, we're just all trying to figure things out here. And I truly hope you value the perspective of myself and other people that, you can learn so much from people of different walks of life. And being a professor has taught me that. Like, I think for me, a transformative part of being a researcher and a scientist has been working in academia and getting to mentor students, because they come from all these different backgrounds. They have different biases than you. Some of them have been hardcore in the trenches of training and following these people. So they'll say all these things that they assume are kind of the standard accepted. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I don't agree with that. Interesting perspective. I'll consider it. And you just kind of learn that people think differently. And an example that comes to mind yesterday, Daniel Plotkin commented on a post that I was involved with, that Holly posted on rest periods. And, we went back and forth a little bit, having a disagreement on the recent rest period meta-analysis. And my opinion was, that meta-analysis had studies that included high load training and studies that included low load training. And I think you can use shorter rest periods of low load training. And his perspective is there's no interaction between load and I think Daniel would be it's public comments. And I'm not saying anything bad either. But there was no interaction between load and rest periods. And in my head, there absolutely was. I've done a lot of low load training research where we consistently use 30 seconds of rest. and we don't get worse growth than traditional high load training with longer rest periods. So in my mind, in the way I conceptualize muscle growth, it's always been a trade-off. If you want to have shorter rest, you have to lower the weights to remain in a hypertrophic rep range. Now, there's probably a point where the rest becomes ridiculously low and you can't recover enough to produce enough contraction to stimulate hypertrophy. But if you're using 30 to 40% of your 1RM, you can get away with shorter rest periods than if you're using 70 or 80% of 1RM. And I also think different exercises. I think on a leg press, you can get away, you need longer rest. And on an isolation movement, you can probably get away with shorter rest. So I say all that to say, I learned that Daniel had a different perspective than me. I operate under the assumption that it's like these meters where if I turn up the load, I got to turn up the rest. If I turn down the load, I can get away with shorter rest. He doesn't think of it that way. He doesn't conceptualize it that way. It probably relates more to volume, where more rest will always lead to more volume. So we have a difference of perspective. I respect his perspective, and I respectfully disagree. I believe that with low load training, it's actually a benefit to employ short rest periods because you can capitalize on the metabolic environment and reach failure more quickly and gain the same growth. And to me, the reason that makes sense, that's the concept behind blood flow restriction. Blood flow restriction is a repetition reducer, not unlike short rest periods, where you capitalize on the metabolic environment and hasten fatigue. You make it happen more quickly. So some people view fatigue as this negative thing that's going to, lessen your volume. But I don't view it that way. I view fatigue as one of the main things. My goal of that exercise set is to fatigue that muscle. And in my mind, if I do that in a more efficient way through short rest periods, that's a benefit. And again, that's just an example to show that a difference in perspective doesn't need to be nasty or they can coexist. Maybe one of us is more right, and maybe no one can necessarily prove the other wrong at this point, but we subscribe to a slightly different model of contraction, activation, and muscle growth.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. It would be, that discussion in itself where you're just talking through it, I think people can learn from that. And you often see it where if people do have respectful back and forth discussions, people comment underneath and be like, hey, that was really interesting. Like I learned a lot from that discussion, what have you. And I think the same can be said for when I've had people on the podcast who come on with differing perspectives about things. I think back to Eric Helms and Mike Israetel coming on and talking about the disagreements behind, I think it was like set kind of additions throughout a mesocycle progression, that sort of thing. And I think that was people learn a load from that. And it can be uncomfortable because I don't know, it feels like it could get personal. But if you're not attacking the person, you're talking about their perspective and the information, and you're kind of challenging that. And ultimately, I think everyone is helping one another grow and develop and learn as well. So interesting with your perspectives there, because I take the same perspective as you on that as well. And it makes me think of Berge's work with Maya reps too, with kind of the purposeful short rest periods there for those. But it is very interesting. And something actually you mentioned, I've seen you talk about is, and I think this is a really good point, that people maybe extrapolate study results too far when applying them to their training. And I had the question of why are you more cautious than others in the field when interpreting hypertrophy research?
I don't think it's necessarily a difference between myself and people in the field at large. I think it might be a difference of social media communication and science, I guess more globally. The way I was mentored and taught is, the way of science is cautious. And, you rarely display confidence because it takes so long to get to that point. And, there's a few different, there's so many different ways you can interpret a finding. And I'll use another example. Hopefully these examples don't get annoying, but I think they're relevant. It helps frame what I'm trying to talk about here. So I will use the new paper on range of motion as an example. You could have a dozen scientists read this paper and they might reach a different conclusion, right? So Milo and Pack might reach the conclusion that the short ranges of motion aren't doing anything because the muscle growth outcomes were similar between length and partials and full range of motion. And you can have that opinion. I respect that opinion. But I might disagree. I might say they both grew the same. They both trained to failure. Isn't it also possible that the fact that they reached sufficient fatigue and failure, could that not be the reason why they both grew, independent of range of motion? Now, that's an equally plausible conclusion based on this data, right? And neither one of them is, well, you can't rule out short range of motion based on the study design, but you're allowed to have that opinion, right? But when you express that in your paper, you have to entertain all possibilities. So science entertains all possibilities, right? So they were the same. Maybe the lengthened part in both groups is the reason that they were the same. Maybe it was a fatigue and activation. Maybe that's the reason they were the same, right? Maybe it's another mechanism that we're not talking about. Maybe that's the reason that they're the same. But science is neutral in that this is what we see. This is what it could be. Future studies are necessary to understand why. Now, independent of that, I can tell you what I believe. But what I believe is different than what I can claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think on social media, the claims and the beliefs get a little intertwined. And I think maybe, and we just need to do a better job of saying, based on this data, I believe this. Other people would disagree and perhaps suggest it's this, right? And to me, it's not a big deal, but it's important, right? Because again, caution is the way of science. Because what if a short range of motion is important? What if, so this paper here kind of infers that the short range of motion is not doing anything. Well, I disagree with that take too. I don't know that we have enough evidence to make that claim. So I think we have to just stay within the lanes of the data. And I'll give you another example of why I think the short range of motion might be important in some instances. You know, if we're going to lean on other pieces of data to build this story, which is kind of what we're doing, you know, this paper, think of the internal external focus from the Schoenfeld lab, right? Focus internally on the squeeze versus just focused on lifting the weight. Now, in that paper, the biceps saw more growth. And in my mind, when you focus on the squeeze, you're kind of focusing on the short part of the, and in that paper, it did something. So we have to reconcile that finding, that piece of data in the context of this. And since this paper can't rule out short muscle lengths doing something important, maybe the position of the scientific community should be, in some instances, long muscle lengths seem to favor distal muscle growth in certain exercises and movements. We can't necessarily comment on all adaptations that take place in skeletal muscle and the potential superiority of other techniques when we would measure different things. But you don't see that caution. Another reason that I think it's a shame if people are throwing away the squeeze. I don't know if you read our no load training study from 2016. Brittany counts as the lead author, but it was basically like posing practice, right? You just flexed your arm.
I have, yes.
Right? And doing no load training, right? No weight, just squeezing your bicep, moving throughout a bicep curl and squeezing your muscle led to the same muscle growth as traditional high load training with a dumbbell, 70% of 1RM. And in my mind, you know, the highest activation was at the shortest muscle lengths. So that doesn't mean that the short muscle lengths are the reason, but you certainly got more of that mind muscle connection at the squeeze and shorten muscle position. So at the very least, we need to be cautious as a scientific community of throwing away A because sometimes B is better, right? So that would be my position. I'm not saying B isn't sometimes better. B is sometimes better when you look at this one outcome, but you don't completely change a paradigm, right? And demonize one thing because something else is good. And it could turn out that we're wasting our time with range of motion, right? And again, I'm using this as an example to frame the discussion because I've thought about it a lot lately. And I was talking to for a while, Holly lived in Fort Lauderdale, so I spent a lot of time hanging out with Brett. And we talk about he different exercises, and I got a standing hip thrust for my lab because it was on sale, and as a guy, I much prefer the standing to the regular hip thrust machines. Um, but that's an exercise where you feel it at the top, you feel it at the squeeze pretty much, and I like it, and I get sore when I use it, and it's targeting a certain aspect of my glute, and I don't think it's doing nothing just because the activation is in the short range of motion. For me, I value that movement and I value that part of the contraction. And I value other exercises for other reasons. I love a single leg press because of the stretch I get in my glute. I value both exercises, and I acknowledge that there's not a compelling enough base of literature to start crossing X's out of certain exercises. When I feel them differently, it's clear that the activation patterns are different and that they could contribute in a different way to my muscle growth journey, right? Um, that's the caution that I have. I think it's just knowing the limits of your ability to interpret something based on the current knowledge base. And I really do believe there is at least a good basis of literature to pull from to suggest short muscle lengths do cause growth, right? And so why is that happening, right? That's a thing. And I think if some people listened to the current content, they would think that it's a complete waste of time. It's not a complete waste of time. It's inferior in some instances for some muscle sites. That's for sure. That looks like it's fairly consistent. Um, the more replication we get, the more confidence that we can have. But there's so many exercises where we don't have the data. And then there's also, hopefully you're okay with the stream of consciousness, Steve. I do this a lot.
No, I like it. It's good. I'd interrupt if it was a problem. Don't worry.
I'm going to give another example where we need to check ourselves, and we need to reflect and think about this, right? Because there's been in my opinion, there's been a lot of conflation between, again, using this as an example, range of motion and exercise selection. Some exercise selection will favor long muscle lengths, and within a range of motion in a given exercise, you could choose which range of motion you want to do. And, for the biceps, if we think about the Zabaleta Corda study that compared the incline dumbbell curl versus the preacher curl, well, the lengthened exercise in that particular study was not superior to the more shortened variation. And, we kind of, it's been speculated that it's because the internal tension was greater at the long muscle lengths. Now, we don't necessarily know that that's the case, right? It's a possibility, but this is at least one example where, okay, the lengthened exercise, the one where the resting state of the muscle was more lengthened, was not superior. So at least there's instances where the exercise that, again, if you're just consuming these shorts, you would think, oh, well, this has to be better than this, right? Well, it's not a consistent finding. And, part of the reason why, and as a scientist, usually we can point to a mechanism that explains something, right? And I've heard a lot of discussions around this particular topic that, you can demonstrate something without knowing the mechanism. That's absolutely true. But when it's a little messy and it's somewhat inconsistent, it would be helpful to have a mechanism, or at least a few speculated mechanisms. And if it's physiological, then it would be true across all muscles, right? So if something about contraction and a long muscle length were superior for stimulating muscle protein synthesis, then this would just be true. Contracting and lengthening state is more anabolic. It seems to have to do more with activation of muscles and leverages, right? Related to mechanics. So that means it's probably an exercise by exercise discussion you know, and some of it makes so much sense, right? When you do the calf raise in the lengthened position, you feel your medial, like, and then when you do a lockout, you feel the lateral. Like I can make each one cramp up by changing that range of motion, and it makes a lot of sense. I think that's a more of a biomechanical thing than a physiological thing, right? And the last thing I'll say, then we'll do next question, or we'll go back and forth a little bit. I've gotten sarcastic in the gym. I'm always thinking about science, and Holly does too. She reads a lot. We write together. But we'll be doing exercises, and it's just my humor, I suppose. She'll pick an exercise, and I'll say, "Holly, according to science, that's not good. That you're wasting your time here." And then I'll follow up with, because fatigue and activation can no longer grow a muscle. It's like fatigue. If you're fatiguing and activating a muscle in an exercise, and you feel that muscle fatigue and being activated, I'm pretty confident that muscle is going to grow. Right now, the part of the muscle you didn't fatigue and activate, I would be pretty confident that it's unlikely to grow. And different people enjoy different things. Like for hamstring exercise, she loves lying hamstring and seated hamstring. I love standing hamstring curl, and it's my preference. It's where I connect the most with the muscle, and in particular, my mind muscle connection at the short range of motion. For some reason, the hamstrings, I love it. Like I get that squeeze, and I get really good fatigue. And I think we also have to be careful not to just throw out individual preferences and differences with how people connect with their muscles. So I'll put a pin in it there so we can have some discussion.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. Additionally, you get access to our exclusive Revive Stronger member site, where you'll be able to watch over hundreds of hours worth of educational content. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
I have a lot of thoughts, but you said a lot of good things. One immediate thought that comes to mind, I remember there was, to bring about the biomechanics kind of talk that was going around, was like the straight bar pull down. It was like, why you use your straight bar to train your lats? Like, it's so much better to be neutral in here, and this should be called the upper back pull down. I'm like, hey, if I do my straight bar pull down, standard grip pull downs like this, I feel really good sensation in my lats and in those kind of fibers. I think it's growing that area if I'm getting a good pump and kind of connection there, potentially some soreness there. So it's similar here. It's like, I think you definitely have to not forget you as an individual and not just listen to broad strokes that are put out there and these sort of things. Also, interpreting studies, I completely relate to that. I think of the deload study that came out through Max Coleman, where some people might interpret that and look at, hey, they didn't need the deload, they didn't get resensitization, they didn't get better results, you don't need to deload. And then other people could look at it and be like, hey, they got the same results, take your whole week off, so they did way less volume in that time, and they got equal results. Look at that. And it's just different perspectives, different biases, looking at it in different ways. And like you said really importantly there, you can only say what was done in that study. So it was whoever the participants were, what have you, over that period of time under that training program. You can't then extrapolate that out. I struggle with that word, extrapolate. Extrapolate. That's why, because when I read it, I want to say extrapolate. There we go. So yeah, you can't extrapolate that out to like every scenario, just similar to, I don't know, I think about aspartame and the mice studies, and people are like, oh, it causes cancer. It's like, yeah, but we're not mice, and also the like dose they were having for their size and all of this, and so that gets dispersed a bit better, and as a community we can be better. But then you'll have the Daily Mail or whatever pick it up and be like, hey, look, aspartame causes cancer. So it's definitely a challenge, and I think part of it, I would say, as you said, importantly, the scientific community and how they communicate it is important. But also I do think there has to be some responsibility taken on the consumer's end as well. Because I think a lot of the time, as an example, Mene Henselmans does a great job of kind of doing these kind of study reviews. He shares them on his social media. And sometimes the titles can be a bit black and white, a bit diversive. And he's doing that for obvious reasons to draw attention. And then some people will just read that and they take that as the take on. But if you read over the slides, you read the caption, you get a really good understanding of his perspective, and it's not normally as black and white as that. But unfortunately, a lot of people will just see that one written sentence and share it. It's kind of the same as reading an abstract. You don't really get to understand what's truly going on. So I would say that as like just another one for people listening, like do your due diligence, follow many people, but also read exactly what the person's saying, not just one line from what they're saying.
Yeah, don't react from the first few words and run away with it. People do that quite often, and I think I'm guilty of it at times. But I usually save something because I file it. I need to read this at some point, and it's hard to read everything and keep. Even when you're in this, it's hard to read and keep up with everything. Do my best.
When you were on for the roundtable, you discussed replicating Brad Schoenfelds' study, looking to try and see if you could kind of uncover anything regarding the inflammation post-training. Have you been still working on that? Has anything come out from that? Because I was interested to see if there was any updates.
Yeah, it's still ongoing. And honestly, this semester, it just got completely derailed by the hurricanes.
Of course.
So yeah, we had Helene and then we had Milton, and those were separated by a week, and we missed school both times. And the second time we completely lost power, so the school was shut down, and we missed too many visits. So we basically are, the way research works, a lot of people don't realize this, but in the United States, studies tend to be 8 weeks because they need to be completed before Thanksgiving break. And in the spring, training studies are typically 6 weeks because they have to be completed before spring break. So like the study duration is very much a function of the academic system that we're operating in and when students leave and when they're present. So there's not enough time this semester to start up the study again because everyone's going to leave for Christmas break for a month, and it would disrupt everything. So we're going to have to kick it back up in January. My preliminary analysis, because I presented some of this recently, we basically have the same sample right now, and currently the muscle growth in the lower body is similar between the groups, and in the upper body hasn't reached statistical significance. So maybe it will with a larger sample, and I don't want to read into those findings too much. But our initial look at the data, I think it's leaning towards 3 and 5 are better than 1 in the lower body, but it's not statistically significant yet. And in the upper body, we haven't had meaningful muscle growth. But again, that was just a quick snapshot, so I could share some data at a conference I was at. I'm excited to finish the study, but it's unfortunately just one of those things that it takes a long time. But I think replication is such an important thing. And I think we do need more of that. It's, especially with how compelling some studies, how influential some studies are, right? If I'm going to change a lot of what I'm doing based on a study, I want to have sufficient confidence that that finding was real. And I'm not like that with just other people's work. I'm like that with my own work. If you read one of my papers and it showed something, I'd be like, I don't know. It looks like this could be a thing, but we should still be cautious. I cannot guarantee you that this is going to result in the outcome that you're chasing. And again, maybe that's the cautious nature of how I was mentored. But I think it's a good approach to interpreting and applying research, because you will typically wait till there's enough evidence or a compelling evidence, or you'll say, I think this, so I do this technique, but I don't really know if it's doing a whole lot.
Yeah, I think that's really fair to say. I'd say that's a evidence-based practitioner style of approach. It's the worst thing that I'm seeing come out sometimes from like science-based lifters is whenever there's a new study that comes out, it shifts their program to doing whatever the new study said. 52 sets for quads when the Enos study came out. Suddenly people are shifting their training completely towards that. I remember, I think I've said it before on the podcast, I shared maybe some of my volume from my quad training, and someone asked like, that was for a single session, right? I was like, no, that's my weekly volume. They're like, whoa, that's way under what's kind of optimal for like quad hypertrophy. I was like, I don't think so, not for me. They're like, oh, you're not changing it based off that new study that came out? I was like, well, no, a new study only maybe slightly shifts my perspective in a direction. With all the literature that we already have in my kind of experience, like cemented in a certain area, it doesn't solely completely change the paradigm. And I don't think any scientific paper that's building upon a strong evidence or body of evidence already is going to do that. So yeah, I think that's an important replication, of course, very important, especially like different labs and things like this, because I think that just gives it extra credibility in that sense.
Yeah. I caught up with Zach and Josh after I was down. They're in Boca, so Fort Lauderdale was pretty close. We grabbed dinner one night, and I think they're laughing because they're like, we didn't expect your volume recommendations to be one of the highest. And I said, yeah, I mean, just because my interpretation of this study and this study is this, it doesn't mean my perspective isn't a little bit different than the research, because I train different than the research, right? And that perspective to me is so valuable, because the NS paper was cool. 52 sets, I would be so scared to roll that out of my lab. So I have tremendous respect for those scientists for doing that. But at the same time, you'll say they answered a specific question, and my view of muscle growth, and I shared in the last podcast, is that after a certain number of sets on a given exercise, you've exhausted what you can get out of that exercise. But you can look at I don't know which paper, the Burke paper. The knee extension and the leg press target the quads a little bit differently. So just because you did sufficient sets on this exercise, well, maybe this exercise is going to grow your muscle a little bit differently. So I like variation of exercise. And I think if you're going to have a high volume program, my hunch would be that, well, the benefit, if you're going to do 52 sets, diversify the exercises. So you're stressing the muscle in many different ways. Maybe some of it is going to target the long muscle lengths. Maybe some of it's going to target the squeeze. And maybe we maximize the likelihood that we've optimized growth across the muscle belly. Another thought when just considering research is, if we measure two muscle sites and I measure your bicep here and here, right? All I know is what happened here and here. And furthermore, my ability to measure growth distally is not as good as my ability to measure growth in the middle of the muscle. It's just a worse image. And so there's so much that there's just uncertainty around it. From a researcher's perspective, when you read that distal hypertrophy was different and the difference was fractions of a centimeter, it's like, well, I am really, really not sure if we could actually show that or have any confidence. But you know what? The potential's there. And if you want to place your bet on the potential, then why not include it? If you have time and if you're recovering, add this variation in. And that's how I like trying new things. I'm obsessed with new equipment, different variations of exercises. And so that's probably why my program, how I actually train, is relatively high volume, but it's spaced out across a variety of movements. And maybe eventually I'll do a study where we actually employ that. But what a lot of people don't realize too is, finding a difference in 8 weeks or 12 weeks time is incredibly difficult to do. you know, and you would need your difference between your training programs to specifically target those certain sites that you're measuring. And how likely is it that you're going to capture that? It's really difficult. Um, Being in science for, not that I've been in science for that long, I guess it's probably coming up on a decade. Um, I've learned the limitations of studying muscle growth in that if I don't find a difference, it doesn't mean that I don't still think there would be one with enough time. And I told that to Brett on the squat versus hip thrust. I told him, I was like, hey, kudos to you for one, for funding the study, and for two, for sharing a different perspective. I said, I still think that with more time, that eventually there would be some separation here. So it's like, that's my application of that study. Just because they're the same does not mean they're the same. It means that how much growth can you actually experience over 8 weeks? And what's the likelihood of being able to detect a difference over 8 weeks? Like that's the true limitation of science. And that's why you have to consider science along with experience and intuition, right? Because you're connecting the dots, but it's never perfect. And not to say the other perspective is wrong, right? The perspective, well, because you see a lot of content with squats and hip thrusts, they're the same. So you can think that, and you can use that study as evidence. But I could also see why an intelligent person, both are intelligent, but a person thinking differently could make the argument that, well, there's this limitation, and this limitation. I still believe this. And if we studied this way, maybe we'd see it. There's nothing wrong with having that perspective. And something that I think happens online, Steve, I think because that study showed that, right? If you take a different perspective, you get, well, you're anti-science, right? And the data shows this. Yeah, but that data has a lot of limitations and a lot of caveats. And if you understand how research works, you know that confidence in any one study is limited. How, how much do we know about measuring the glutes? What should a change look like? There's all this stuff that goes into providing an interpretation. And I think it's a wonderful thing when people have that disagreement. Because wouldn't it be a shame if people started giving up hip thrusts and they were better, and we just, haven't shown it relative to that movement yet? Again, there's that caution, but, there's so few moments in science where you actually have the confidence it's often conveyed, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Something I often think about is my experience and perspectives and that sort of thing aren't what everyone else's are. So I think about it with my clients. Like I have my preferences. I have the way that I like to train. I have the volumes that I tend to work with, but that doesn't mean that's going to apply perfectly to them. And I'd be a poor coach if I thought that. So if you just see research and you just apply it broad strokes, it's like, well, this was the average result. Like you said, there's all these limitations. So you can have a different perspective. One of those that immediately comes to mind, because I'm currently being coached under Cliff Wilson, and he has a high protein preference. So I'm on much higher than a gram per pound. And some people in the evidence-based space would say, hey, even a gram per pound is excessive. You only need like 0.7 to maximize MPS and muscle growth. But he has me on much higher. And I respect Cliff because he's got a wealth of experience with people like me who are looking to get the results that I'm looking to get. And so I trust him. And I'm also aware of the fact that, hey, the downsides are relatively small so long as I'm not taking my carbs or fats too low. And I tend to have a slightly higher protein preference too. And I think there's even limitations to some of that research where it's like a lot of it's self-reported. Maybe they're underreporting their protein intake. These sort of things, they're just things and questions that come to mind. So I do think some people are too quick to dismiss their own experiences or the wealth of wisdom that can come from someone like a Brett Contreras, who has been trying to maximize glute growth for like decades probably at this point. And he seems to implement some exercises and techniques that many other practitioners don't. And that's okay. Like you can't say, oh, Brett, you haven't got papers on backing up all of this. And your volumes are way exorbitant. It's like, hey, it's clearly working for his kind of clientele. There's a reason he's got kind of the name he's got in the industry and space. So I think you sharing kind of your different perspectives is important, and it helps like everyone drive forward. And something you've mentioned a few times, Sam, and that's the way I viewed you. And the reason I've got you on today is because whenever I've communicated with you, whenever I've seen you communicate with others, it's always done in a respectful, constructive manner. It isn't done in a just unnecessary, trying to be kind of contrarian, conflicting for the sake of, I don't know, you see people in the space do it, right? Where they're just unnecessarily brutal or like conflicting, and they're just trying to bring about arguments for the sake of getting more eyes on their content. You don't do that. And so I think your perspective here has been really valuable.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's funny. It's how my mind's programmed. When I hear something, I immediately go why, and then I typically dig too far, to the point where I get to the point where I'm not sure. And I think disagreement in science is just a truly wonderful thing, because it sharpens everybody, right? Everybody wins. And I hope this resonates with some people. Everybody wins when there's disagreement, because, you know, if I'm saying that, I'm not convinced on this length and partial stuff, then you have to strengthen your argument, right? And I also have to read and realize that, oh, in this instance, this is an interesting piece of data. Why is this happening? And then, I might design a study to try to figure out why that's happening, because I don't understand it, right? And I want to understand things. And, I have this obsessive nature of reading every paper and putting the change scores into Excel sheets and looking at it and seeing what I can find out from it. And I love engaging on these topics and talking to people that think differently. It's like, okay, why do you think that? That's interesting. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that could be the case. But I think everyone wins when that happens, because, everything gets fuzzy for a little bit, and then, the clarity will eventually, I think, be the case. But sometimes I feel like I disagree too much, but I think I wouldn't enjoy my job if I didn't. Like, if everything were known and everyone agreed, that's it's really boring. There's always some nuance. There's always something to pick at that's like, huh, but why did that actually happen? And I think that's actually the reason I love science, is because of that. There's always some more depth there. There's always some digging to be done, and some thinking, and we have a long way to go on a lot of topics. I think, I believe over the next 10 years, we're going to learn more about volume. I think we're going to learn more about range of motion. I think we have more to learn about rest periods, and I'll lean towards my hypothesis, but I'll be open to the possibility that longer might be better. But I think it's load and exercise dependent, and yeah, I'm glad it comes across that way. And anyone, if you ever have disagreed with me, just know I'm just sitting there smiling and trying to, share a thought back. And I think it's really important not to connect yourself to these ideas. Like, I don't know what my identity would be as a scientist. I can remember when we first published on this idea that muscle growth wasn't driving strength adaptations. And we were leaving the lab. It's during my PhD. And I turned to Scott Dankel. Scott Dankel's a brilliant scientist. And I said, because we just submitted the paper. This was like the first controversial thing I'd published. And I've published quite a bit of controversial takes. And I turned to Scott and I said, Scott, do you think we're right? Because that means something to, especially when I was in my early 20s and was uncertain. And he goes, yeah, I think we probably are. And I said, I think we are too. So I felt good about that, and I felt good that a different perspective was getting shared. And over time, I've evolved my thinking where I don't think I was completely right. But I also know that the whole field changed a little bit because of that. And now people discuss this one thing a little bit differently, and have a different perspective. Things got nasty between some folks for a little bit, like, oh, I didn't realize this gets personal, but it does. But I never take it that way. Like, these are just ideas and I'm just a guy in an office. So Ton of fun.
And I think that's the right way to be. You don't want to identify with something in particular. I can't think of anything that immediately comes to mind, but I think that's when it can become a problem. Like, I don't know, when it was big to do like high intensity interval training, and there was like the afterburn effect. And if you suddenly, that's your identity, that's what you're all about, is this one specific thing, that can become a problem if it becomes found out that it's now suboptimal, not the right route. So I think you have an overarching like, hey, I'm not about any specific one thing, it's hypertrophy at large, and following the evidence and continuing to do that and challenge preconceived beliefs and like, I don't know, make us honest and communicate that better and share different perspectives. And I think that does help everyone grow. So yeah, Sam, I definitely get that from you and get that from kind of what you're doing at the moment with everything that you're communicating over on social media. So yeah, hopefully off the back of this, people will have opened their eyes and ears and minds even more. And if people want to keep up to date with you, Sam, your lab, where should they head? Have you got anything that's kind of going on that people should know about?
Yeah, I mean, I post our research on my Instagram, which I think it's at Samuel Buckner. So when we publish new papers, I'll share them, and I'll communicate different things. I'll occasionally post my thoughts. I'm not a content creator or anything, so I'm not pumping out high quality content all the time. I did start a research review with Holly that we've been doing for about 4 or 5 months. So that's called Be a Brain, and that's been fun. Not something I've done before, but I think I got frustrated enough of hearing the same take that I thought that the space could use the diversity of thought. So that's something we put out every month, and we review 4 different articles. Other than that, I think I said last time, you can catch me in the comment section, just sharing my thoughts. And a lot of people DM me asking my thoughts on various things, and I do my best to answer and provide. Sometimes I get these paragraphs though, it's like, okay, I'm gonna save this till Friday.
Yes.
I have to sit down, read it, check some references here. But yeah, I love what I do. I love talking about muscle. So hit me up. We'll talk about muscle. And if you're interested in a master's program, I think the USF master's program is amazing. I'm always looking for students that want to study muscle growth and want to be part of the lab. So just shoot me an email or a message if you're interested.
Awesome. Your Instagram is Samuel Buckner. I just checked, and I'll make sure that's linked. That shows that you're not a content creator or an influencer. You don't know your handle off the top of your head, so that's fine. You are a through and through researcher, and it's cool to hear that you have. Actually, I think I've seen the Be a Brain. I haven't subscribed to it. I can't say that, but I have seen that you're doing that. So I think that's cool. If again, another perspective out there, and it's good stuff. So I'll make sure that that's linked so people can go check that out. And again, thank you, Sam, and thank you guys for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.